The bells of Whitby Abbey rang frantically through the dawn mist of 867 AD, but it was already too late. The longships had beached in darkness, and Norse warriors were already inside the walls. Sister Elfgifu, barely 17 and dedicated to Christ just 3 months ago, heard the screaming from the dormitory and knew her life, as she understood it, had just ended. But death, she would soon discover, wasn't what the Vikings had planned for her. The raiders weren't here for gold, though they would take it. They weren't here for religious artifacts, though those would be stripped from the altars. They were here for something far more valuable in the Viking economy, something that could work, could breed, could be sold and resold across half the known world. They were here for the women. What happened to Sister Elfgifu and the 32 other nuns captured that morning wasn't unique. It was systematic, calculated, part of an economic and social system that made human trafficking one of the primary drivers of Viking expansion. The Vikings didn't just raid for treasure, they raided for people, and specifically for women who would disappear into a network of slavery, forced assimilation, and generational bondage that stretched from Iceland to Baghdad. The chronicles written by surviving monks describe the immediate violence, the burning buildings, the slaughtered defenders, the desecration of holy spaces. But they fall silent about what happened to the women who were dragged onto the longships. That silence speaks louder than any description. What happened to captured women was considered too disturbing, too shameful, or simply too overwhelming to record in detail. Tonight, you're going to discover what those chronicles couldn't bring themselves to describe. The reality of what Vikings did to captured women goes far beyond the Hollywood images of savage raiders. This was organized, institutionalized human trafficking on a scale that reshaped the demographics of Europe. It was a system where women weren't just victims, but commodities, their value carefully calculated based on age, beauty, skills, and fertility. From the thrall markets of Dublin, where women were examined like livestock, to the harems of Baghdad, where blonde slaves commanded premium prices, to the isolated farmsteads of Iceland, where captured women lived and died in bondage. This is the complete story of what Vikings really did to the women they captured, and why what happened after the raids was often worse than the raids themselves. The Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD shocked Christian Europe, not just because of its violence, but because of its target selection. The raiders bypassed several wealthy estates to attack a monastery. Why? The answer reveals the cold economic calculation behind Viking raids. Monasteries and convents contained concentrated populations of young, healthy, literate women who had no children and were guaranteed to be virgins. In the Viking slave economy, these qualities multiplied value exponentially. The Arabic chronicler Ibn Rusta, writing in the 10th century, documented the price differentials in Viking slave markets. An ordinary male slave might fetch 30 silver dirhams. A skilled craftsman, perhaps 50. But a young woman? She started at 100 dirhams, and that was for someone considered plain. A beautiful woman could command 300. A virgin from a noble family who could read and write? The price could exceed 1,000 dirhams, more than most Vikings would see in a lifetime. This economic reality transformed Viking raiding from opportunistic piracy into strategic human trafficking. Raiders didn't randomly attack coastal settlements. They gathered intelligence about where to find the most valuable women. Irish annals record Vikings timing their attacks to coincide with religious festivals when young women would gather at churches. They knew when noble families held weddings that would concentrate wealthy women in vulnerable locations. They had informants who could identify which convents housed the daughters of nobility. The logistics of female captivity began the moment of capture. Women weren't simply grabbed and thrown onto ships. They were sorted, evaluated, and processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Age was checked by examining teeth and hands. Virgin status was verified through examinations that medieval chroniclers describe only in horrified euphemisms. Skills were tested. Could she weave? Could she read? Could she sing? Each ability added to her market value. The journey from capture to sale was carefully managed to preserve value. Women were kept in separate holds from male captives, not from any sense of propriety, but because pregnant slaves sold for less. Pregnancy was proof they were no longer virgins, and introduced uncertainty about survival through childbirth. They were fed better than male slaves because visible health affected price. They were prevented from self-harm through constant restraint because damaged goods brought lower prices. The Viking slave network operated with sophisticated understanding of market demands. Brunettes were preferred in Mediterranean markets where blonde women were exotic. Blondes commanded premiums in Middle Eastern markets where they were rare. Young girls were often held for years, fed and trained until they reached peak market value in their teens. Older women who might not sell well as concubines were evaluated for other skills, midwifery, weaving, household management, that could make them valuable in different markets. The infrastructure supporting this human trafficking was extensive. Specialized ships were built with holds designed for human cargo. Slave pens were constructed at major ports like Hedeby, Dublin, and Birka. Food supplies were pre-positioned along slave routes. Networks of merchants extended from Scandinavia through Russia to Constantinople and Baghdad, each taking their percentage as human cargo moved through their territories. When Sister Elfgifu arrived in Norway after weeks in the suffocating hold of a longship, she entered a slavery system that was foundational to Viking society. The Old Norse word thrall, didn't just mean slave. It described a complete social category, as fundamental to Viking society as nobility or priesthood. Conservative estimates suggest that thralls made up between 25 and 30% of Scandinavia's population during the Viking Age. In Iceland, the percentage was even higher. The moment a captured woman became a thrall, she ceased to be legally human. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, is explicit. Thralls were property, not people. They could be bought, sold, traded, given as gifts, or killed without legal consequence. If someone injured a thrall, they paid compensation to the owner for property damage, not to the thrall for suffering. A woman who had been free, perhaps even noble, instantly became an object upon capture. The classification of female thralls was precise and horrible in its implications. Ambat was a general female slave. Dagia was a slave who worked with dairy, valuable because she could increase wealth through cheese and butter production. Seta was a concubine slave, whose primary value was sexual availability to her master and his guests. Each classification came with different expectations, different treatment, and different forms of exploitation. The daily reality for female thralls was relentless labor and complete vulnerability. They woke before dawn to tend fires in Scandinavian winters. Letting the fire die could mean death for everyone, so this responsibility fell to those whose lives were valued least. They prepared food they weren't allowed to eat until everyone else had finished. They wove cloth they would never wear. They raised children who weren't theirs, while their own children, if they were allowed to keep them, grew up as property. The sexual exploitation of female thralls wasn't just common, it was institutionalized. The sagas speak matter-of-factly about masters visiting their female thralls. Sons of the household were often initiated with female thralls. Guests were offered female thralls as hospitality. When archaeologists excavate Viking Age settlements, they find the small, windowless outbuildings where female thralls were kept specifically to be accessible for sexual exploitation. Children born from these encounters occupied a complex position. They were still thralls unless formally freed by their father, which required admitting paternity and paying compensation to the owner himself for the loss of property. Many masters never bothered. The result was generations of children who were half-siblings to the free children of the household, but lived as their slaves. The psychological dynamics of such households were devastating. The work assigned to female thralls was deliberately chosen to be endless and degrading. Grinding grain with hand querns was a common assignment. Hours of repetitive, exhausting labor that destroyed shoulders and backs. Processing human waste for fertilizer was another thrall task. The worst jobs, the ones that broke bodies and spirits, were reserved for those whose suffering didn't legally matter. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of the thrall system was how it created hierarchies among the enslaved. Female thralls who bore their masters' children might gain slightly better treatment. Those who showed exceptional skills might be given positions managing other thralls. This created a system where thralls policed each other, where the enslaved enforced slavery, where hope of marginal improvement prevented unified resistance. The killing of thralls reveals the ultimate expression of their non-human status. When a wealthy Viking died, thralls might be sacrificed to serve them in the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan's famous account of a Viking funeral on the Volga describes a female thrall being volunteered for sacrifice, then given alcohol and drugs before being murdered through a combination of strangulation and stabbing. The matter-of-fact nature of his description suggests this wasn't unusual. The slave market at Hedeby, near modern-day Schleswig in Germany, operated every day except during the harshest winter months. Contemporary accounts describe a scene that would haunt any observer with a functioning conscience. Hundreds of women, stripped for inspection, standing on platforms while buyers examined them like livestock. The Viking slave trade wasn't conducted in shadows. It was public, normalized, and celebrated as evidence of Viking commercial sophistication. The Dublin slave market, established by Vikings in the 9th century, became the largest human trafficking hub in Western Europe. Irish chronicles record that by 871 AD, Dublin had dedicated infrastructure for processing human cargo, holding pens sorted by age and gender, medical inspection stations to identify diseases, training facilities where captured women were taught skills that would increase their value, and even primitive pregnancy testing to verify fertility. The examination process at these markets was methodical and dehumanizing. Women were displayed naked regardless of weather, their bodies inspected for any defects that might affect price. Teeth were checked for age and health. Hands were examined for calluses that would indicate previous servitude versus soft hands, suggesting noble birth. Hair was pulled to ensure it wasn't dyed or false. Every orifice was examined for signs of disease or previous childbirth. The Arab geographer Ibn Hawqal, visiting Viking slave markets, noted the particular cruelty of the display methods. Women were made to walk, run, and assume various positions to demonstrate physical capacity. They were ordered to sing to prove they could entertain. Those who claimed skills like weaving or embroidery had to demonstrate them while naked and shivering, knowing that failure to prove their value might mean being sold for menial labor or worse. The categorization of women in slave markets reveals the horrifying sophistication of Viking human trafficking. Young girls, typically aged 8 to 12, were sold as investment properties. Buyers would raise them for a few years, then either use them or resell them at peak value. Teenagers were the premium market, old enough to work and breed, but young enough to provide years of service. Women in their 20s were valued for proven fertility and skills. Women over 30 were typically sold cheaply for hard labor, their fate often worse than death. The price negotiations were conducted with the same seriousness as any commercial transaction. Buyers would argue that a woman's eyes were too close together, reducing her beauty value. Sellers would counter that her wide hips promised easy childbearing. The woman herself stood silent. Speaking without permission would result in beating and lower price. Her humanity was so thoroughly erased that her own sale was discussed as if she wasn't present. Some markets specialized in specific types of women. The Swedish town of Birka was known for Slavic women captured from raids along the eastern rivers. Kaupang in Norway specialized in Irish and Scottish women taken from Celtic lands. Each market developed expertise in evaluating and pricing women from different cultures, understanding which features and skills commanded premiums in various destinations. The transportation networks linking these markets were extensive. Women captured in Ireland might be sold initially in Dublin, then resold in York, then moved to Denmark, then shipped to Novgorod, and finally sold in Constantinople or Baghdad. At each transfer, prices increased and conditions worsened. A woman might change hands a dozen times, each sale stripping away more of her identity and hope. The payment systems for slave purchases reveal the enormous wealth generated by human trafficking. While small transactions might use silver coins, large purchases of multiple women were paid in hack silver, precisely weighed pieces of silver jewelry cut to exact values. Archaeological finds of traders' scales and weights at Viking sites often include human teeth and small bones, grim reminders of what was being weighed and valued. The seasonal patterns of slave trading followed raid schedules. Spring and summer saw the highest volumes as raiders returned with fresh captives. Autumn markets featured women who had been seasoned, trained, broken, and prepared for specific roles. Winter markets were smaller, selling women who hadn't sold earlier, often at steep discounts to buyers willing to feed them through the cold months. Dublin, under Viking rule, became something unprecedented in European history, an entire city whose economy centered on human trafficking. By the 10th century, Dublin wasn't just a market where slaves were sold, it was a processing center, where captured women were transformed into commodities through systematic breaking of spirit, specialized training, and calculated exploitation that maximized their sale value. The Annals of Ulster record that in 951 AD, over 3,000 women were processed through Dublin's slave facilities in a single year. These weren't random captures, but targeted acquisitions. Viking raiders operating from Dublin would receive specific orders: 20 young women who could weave, 10 who could read Latin, usually nuns, 30 of childbearing age with proven fertility. They would then launch raids designed to fulfill these orders, turning human trafficking into a made-to-order business. The infrastructure of slavery in Dublin was extensive. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the remains of the slave pens along the Liffey River, stone foundations of buildings designed to hold hundreds of people, with separate sections for different categories of captives. Post holes indicate wooden palisades that created corridors, forcing newly arrived captives to move in specific directions, sorted like mail into different categories for processing. The breaking houses were perhaps the most horrific innovation of Dublin's slave trade. These were facilities where newly captured women were subjected to systematic processes designed to destroy their will to resist. Food deprivation, sleep disruption, constant verbal degradation, and calculated violence were applied with scientific precision. The Norse had discovered that 3 weeks was typically enough to break most women's spirits without damaging their market value. Women who resisted faced escalating punishments documented in the fragmentary annals of Ireland. The first resistance earned beating, the second, branding. The third, mutilation of ears or nose that would drastically reduce sale value, an economic threat that usually ended resistance. Women learned that their only value to their captors was their marketability, and anything that reduced that value would only worsen their situation. The training facilities in Dublin specialized in transforming captured women into specific types of slaves. Some were taught Norse language and customs to serve in Scandinavian households. Others learned Arabic phrases and Islamic protocols for sale to Muslim markets. Irish women captured from noble families were sometimes trained in skills they already possessed: literacy, music, poetry, but now redirected toward pleasing future owners. The medical facilities, crude as they were, reveal the cold economics of human trafficking. Women were treated for injuries and illnesses, not from compassion but to preserve value. Pregnancy was managed based on market calculations, sometimes terminated if the woman was destined for immediate sale, sometimes encouraged if the buyer wanted breeding stock. Disease outbreaks could destroy profits, so sick women were isolated or killed to protect the investment in healthier captives. The psychological manipulation employed in Dublin was sophisticated. Women from the same communities were separated to prevent solidarity. False promises of eventual freedom were used to encourage cooperation. Women who showed exceptional beauty or skills were told they would become wives rather than slaves, a lie that many desperately wanted to believe. The systematic destruction of hope was as calculated as any other aspect of the trade. The saga of Melkorka, recorded in the Laxdala saga, provides a rare glimpse into forced assimilation from a woman's perspective, albeit filtered through Norse storytellers. Melkorka was allegedly an Irish princess, captured in a Viking raid and sold in a Norwegian slave market. But her story, whether historically accurate or partially fictionalized, illustrates the systematic erasure of identity that captured women endured. Upon capture, women's names were often the first thing taken from them. They were given Norse names that marked them as property, names like Ambat, female slave, or descriptive names like Meal, fresh snow, that reduced them to physical characteristics. Their original names were forbidden, and using them could result in punishment. This linguistic erasure was the first step in destroying their previous identities. Religious conversion was forced, though conversion implies a change of belief when what actually occurred was compulsory participation in Norse religious practices. Captured Christian women were made to eat horse meat sacrificed to Norse gods, violating their religious dietary laws. They were forced to participate in pagan festivals, sometimes in roles that directly violated their Christian beliefs. Nuns might be made to serve as temple prostitutes during fertility festivals, the violation of their vows serving as entertainment for their captors. The clothing transformation was immediate and symbolic. Whatever a woman wore when captured, whether nun's habit, noble dress, or peasant clothes, was stripped away and often burned in front of her. She was given the rough, undyed wool clothes of a thrall, identical to every other slave's garments. Personal ornaments, religious symbols, anything that connected her to her past life was destroyed or sold. She was visually erased and rebuilt as property. Language isolation was systematic. Women were forbidden to speak their native languages and punished for doing so. But more insidiously, they were often placed in situations where no one else spoke their language, forcing them to learn Norse simply to communicate basic needs. Children of captured women were raised speaking only Norse, creating a generation gap that isolated mothers from their own offspring. The forced participation in Norse household life was designed to break down resistance through routine. Captured women were made to prepare Norse foods, maintain Norse homes according to Norse customs, and participate in Norse social structures. Over months and years, the constant performance of Norse daily life could erode original cultural practices through sheer repetition and exhaustion. Sexual assimilation was particularly traumatic. Women were often given to Norsemen as concubines or forced wives, expected to bear and raise Norse children. These children would be raised in Norse culture, sometimes taught to despise their mother's origins. The psychological torture of raising children, who were taught to see you as inferior, as conquered, as rightfully enslaved, was a refinement of cruelty that broke many women's spirits completely. The rare women who gained status through bearing sons to powerful Norsemen faced a different kind of erasure. They might gain material comfort, even limited authority over other slaves, but at the cost of completely abandoning their original identity. They had to become enthusiastically Norse, more Norse than the Norse themselves, to maintain their precarious position. Any sign of attachment to their origins could result in losing everything. Not all captured women ended up in slavery. For noble women, capture could begin a different kind of torment, becoming pawns in elaborate ransom negotiations that could last years, leaving them suspended between captivity and freedom while their fate was decided by economic and political calculations that had nothing to do with their well-being. The Annals of Ulster record that in 941 AD, the Vikings captured the wife and daughter of Muirchertach mac Nael, king of Ailech. The ransom demanded wasn't just gold, it was political submission, territorial concessions, and ongoing tribute payments. The women were held for 3 years while negotiations continued, their treatment improving or worsening based on their families' cooperation. They were tools of statecraft, their bodies and minds hostage to political maneuvering. The ransom process was codified into sophisticated systems. Vikings maintained networks of intermediaries who could communicate ransom demands to victims' families. They understood different cultures' ransom protocols, how much an Irish noble family could realistically pay versus a Frankish one, what forms of payment were acceptable, what symbolic gestures of submission maximized both profit and humiliation. Women held for ransom occupied a liminal space in Viking society. They weren't quite slaves, but weren't free. They might be housed comfortably to preserve their value, but were constantly reminded of their powerlessness. They were often forced to write letters to their families describing their treatment, letters dictated by captors who used the women's own words as weapons of psychological warfare against their loved ones. The waiting was often the worst part. Months or years might pass while families gathered ransom funds. During this time, women lived in constant uncertainty. Would their families pay? Could their families pay? What would happen if payment couldn't be arranged? Some women discovered they had been abandoned, their families unwilling or unable to pay, and transitioned from ransom captives to permanent slaves. The delivery of ransom was itself dangerous. Families had to trust that Vikings would honor agreements, knowing that many captives were never returned, even after payment. Some Vikings developed reputations as honest ransom traders who could be trusted to return captives, while others were known for taking payment, then selling the women anyway, or demanding additional payments after the initial ransom was paid. The Viking focus on raiding monasteries and convents wasn't just about easy wealth. It was strategic targeting of institutions that concentrated vulnerable women. Nuns represented a particularly valuable category of captive. They were literate, virgin, often from noble families, and their capture served the dual purpose of economic gain and symbolic humiliation of Christianity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records with horror the Viking attacks on convents, particularly the raid on Coldingham Priory where the nuns, led by Abbess Ebbe, mutilated their own faces to make themselves undesirable to Viking raiders. They cut off their noses and upper lips, presenting themselves as grotesque masks of their former selves. The Vikings, enraged at being denied valuable captives, burned the convent with all the nuns inside, but the stories spread, showing how desperately religious women feared capture. The systematic nature of convent raids reveals careful intelligence gathering. Vikings knew which convents housed young noblewomen sent for education. They knew when new novices would arrive. They knew which abbesses were from wealthy families that could pay ransoms. This wasn't random violence, but calculated targeting of specific institutions at specific times for maximum profit. The treatment of captured nuns was particularly cruel because their religious status added value in certain markets. In the Islamic slave markets, virgin nuns commanded premium prices as exotic curiosities. The violation of Christian religious women was seen as a form of triumph over Christianity itself. Some were kept as specific trophy slaves, their habits modified into sexualized costumes, their prayers turned into entertainment for their captors. The destruction of religious communities through the removal of women had long-lasting consequences. Convents weren't just religious institutions, but centers of learning, healing, and social support. When Vikings carried off entire populations of nuns, they destroyed networks of literacy, medical knowledge, and social welfare that took generations to rebuild. The fear of raids led many convents to relocate inland, changing the geographic distribution of religious and educational institutions across Europe. The psychological warfare aspect of targeting religious women extended beyond the immediate victims. Christian chroniclers describe the particular horror of seeing women dedicated to God subjected to slavery and violation. It challenged the fundamental belief that God protected the faithful, creating crises of faith that Vikings exploited. Some raiders would force captured nuns to publicly renounce Christianity, using their broken faith as propaganda about Norse superiority over the Christian God. Ireland suffered more from Viking slave raids than perhaps any other region, with the possible exception of the Slavic lands that gave their name to slavery itself. The Irish annals record year after year of raids specifically targeting women, creating a cultural trauma that resonated through generations of Irish literature, law, and social structure. The Annals of the Four Masters record that in 821 AD, the Vikings carried away many women from Howth. In 836, they took a great prey of women from the territories around Dublin. In 847, they carried off women innumerable from across Leinster. The repetition, year after year, created a society that lived in constant fear of female abduction. Every woman near the coast lived knowing she could be taken at any moment. The Irish developed elaborate warning systems specifically for Viking raids. Church bells had different patterns for different threats: fire, storm, death, and a specific rapid pattern that meant Vikings. Women had designated hiding places: underground souterrains, island refuges, forest camps, where they would flee when the warning came. But Vikings learned these patterns too, timing raids for when women would be gathered for markets, festivals, or religious ceremonies. The impact on Irish marriage and family structures was profound. Families began marrying daughters younger, believing married women might be less valuable to raiders. Some regions developed customs of temporary marriages that could be quickly dissolved if a woman was captured, allowing her family to avoid the shame of having a daughter enslaved. The constant threat of female abduction created a society perpetually anxious about women's safety and family honor. The Irish response evolved from hiding to resistance to collaboration. Some Irish kings began capturing women from rival kingdoms to sell to Vikings, turning the slave trade into a tool of warfare between Irish factions. The Vikings established alliances with Irish nobles, who would provide intelligence about where to find valuable women in exchange for shares of profits or political support. The slave trade became integrated into Irish political economy. The genetic impact on Ireland was substantial. DNA studies suggest that many Norwegians have Irish maternal ancestry, evidence of the thousands of Irish women taken as slaves to Scandinavia. Conversely, many Irish have Scandinavian ancestry, often through maternal lines, suggesting Viking men fathering children with enslaved Irish women. The slave trade literally changed the genetic composition of both populations. While Western European chroniclers documented Viking raids extensively, the suffering of Slavic women taken in Viking slave raids along the eastern rivers is less well documented, but possibly even more extensive. The very word slave derives from Slav, indicating the massive scale of human trafficking from these regions. The Rus Vikings, who controlled the river routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea, built their entire economy on capturing and selling Slavic women. The primary chronicle, also known as the Tale of Bygone Years, describes how Viking raiders would sweep through Slavic settlements along the Dnieper, Volga, and other rivers, taking entire populations of women. These weren't coastal raids that allowed for quick escape, but systematic penetrations deep into continental Europe, where geography offered no protection. Slavic women had nowhere to hide when the rivers that brought trade also brought slavers. The Arabic chronicler Ibn Rusta described the Rus Vikings' treatment of Slavic captives with clinical detail. Women were kept in large wooden barracks, chained but accessible to any Viking who wanted them. They were fed just enough to maintain health for sale. Pregnant women were monitored, If the pregnancy proceeded well, the child would increase the sale lot. If complications arose, the pregnancy would be terminated to preserve the mother's sale value. The casual cruelty of these calculations reveals the complete commodification of human life. The journey down the rivers to slave markets was itself a form of torture. Women were packed into ships designed for cargo, not people. They traveled for weeks through territories where escape meant certain death in unfamiliar wilderness. At portages where ships had to be carried overland, women were forced to walk in chains, carrying supplies while their captors rowed. Many died during transport, their bodies thrown into rivers where they floated past Slavic settlements as warnings of what happened to those taken by Vikings. The Constantinople slave market was the ultimate destination for many Slavic women. The Byzantine Empire's demand for fair-skinned slaves was insatiable, and Vikings controlled the supply. The Rus Vikings developed sophisticated assessment systems for determining which women would bring the best prices in Byzantine markets. They looked for specific facial features, body types, and colorings that Byzantine buyers preferred. Women were sorted and grouped based on these characteristics, like products in a catalog. The scale of Slavic slavery was staggering. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, visiting the Rus Vikings on the Volga, described seeing hundreds of Slavic women in a single encampment, all destined for sale. He noted that every Rus Viking of any status owned at least one or two Slavic slave women, and wealthy ones might own dozens. The casualness with which these women were used and discarded shocked even Ibn Fadlan, who came from a society that practiced slavery. When a captured woman finally reached her destination, whether a farmstead in Iceland, a longhouse in Norway, or a trading post in Sweden, her ordeal was far from over. Life as a female thrall in a Viking household was a carefully structured system of exploitation that extracted maximum value from her body and labor, while systematically destroying her humanity. The physical space allocated to female thralls reveals their status. Archaeological excavations of Viking-age farms consistently find small outbuildings, often partially underground, located near but separate from the main longhouse. These slave quarters were typically single rooms where multiple female thralls slept on bare earth covered with straw. No heating, except what seeped from the main house. No windows, doors that locked from the outside. These weren't homes, but storage facilities for human property. The daily routine began before dawn. Female thralls were responsible for starting all fires in the household, a critical task in Scandinavian winters where a dead fire could mean frozen death. They prepared breakfast for the free household, while receiving only scraps themselves. The sagas occasionally mention the diet of thralls: barley porridge, whey, fish heads, and whatever spoiled food the free family wouldn't eat. Deliberate malnutrition kept them weak and dependent. The labor assigned to female thralls was calculated to be endless and exhausting. Grinding grain with hand querns required hours of repetitive motion that destroyed shoulders and backs. A household might need several pounds of flour daily, all ground by hand by women whose own hunger was never fully satisfied. Textile production, carding, spinning, weaving, consumed every moment not spent on other tasks. A female thrall might work 18 hours daily, every day, until her body simply gave out. The sexual availability expected of female thralls permeated every aspect of their existence. They couldn't refuse anyone in the household, not the master, not his sons, not his guests. The sagas speak casually of men visiting their female thralls, using euphemisms that barely conceal systematic rape. When guests arrived, offering female thralls for their use was considered hospitality. Refusing such hospitality was an insult that could start feuds. Children born from these encounters faced terrible fates. If acknowledged by the father, they might be freed, but this required the father to pay himself compensation for the loss of property, an irony that revealed the perverse logic of the slave system. More often, children remained slaves. growing up serving half-siblings who were free. The psychological dynamics of such households, where children of the same father were divided between freedom and slavery, created generational trauma that echoed through bloodlines. The violence female thralls endured went beyond sexual assault. Beatings were routine and required no justification. The Graga's law code states that a master could beat a thrall for any reason as long as they didn't cause permanent disability that would reduce the thrall's work capacity. Killing a thrall wasn't murder, but property destruction. The only consequence was the loss of the thrall's value. Female thralls lived knowing they could be killed on a whim, with no legal recourse. The isolation was deliberate and devastating. Female thralls were forbidden from forming relationships with each other that might lead to solidarity. They were moved between households to prevent long-term bonds. They were set against each other, with slightly better treatment for those who informed on others. The systematic prevention of human connection was designed to make resistance impossible. The mental and emotional destruction of captured women was not an unfortunate side effect of Viking slavery. It was an intentional, systematic process designed to create complete psychological dependence. The Vikings understood that physical chains were less effective than psychological ones, and they developed sophisticated methods for breaking down women's mental resistance that would be recognized today as calculated psychological torture. The initial disorientation was carefully orchestrated. Women were captured from familiar environments and immediately thrust into completely alien situations. They were surrounded by people speaking an incomprehensible language, practicing unfamiliar customs, wearing strange clothes. Everything familiar was stripped away simultaneously, creating a psychological crisis that made resistance seem impossible. This deliberate disorientation was the first step in breaking down independent identity. Language isolation was weaponized. Women were punished for speaking their native languages, but initially couldn't understand Norse commands, creating situations where they were constantly failing and being punished for failures they couldn't avoid. This learned helplessness, where nothing you do can prevent punishment, is now known to create profound psychological damage. The Vikings discovered this principle centuries before psychology named it. The manipulation of hope and despair was precise. Women might be told they would be freed after a certain period of good service, only to have that promise withdrawn. They might be allowed to write to their families, creating hope of ransom, only to learn later that the letters were never sent. They might be told their families had abandoned them, that their homeland had been destroyed, that everyone they knew was dead. Truth and lies were mixed deliberately to create maximum psychological instability. The systematic humiliation served to destroy self-worth. Women were given degrading names, forced to perform humiliating tasks, made to serve people younger than them, required to show submission through specific postures and phrases. The constant reinforcement of inferior status wasn't just about maintaining control, but about making women internalize their worthlessness until resistance became psychologically impossible. The use of other female thralls as enforcers created complex psychological dynamics. Longer enslaved women were often given authority over newer captives, but this authority was conditional on maintaining the system of oppression. This created situations where the enslaved became complicit in enslavement, where victims enforced victimization, where the oppressed maintained oppression. The psychological complexity of these relationships made unified resistance nearly impossible. Despite the overwhelming system of oppression, captured women resisted in ways both dramatic and subtle. The historical record, written primarily by their captors, only hints at these resistances, but archaeological evidence and reading between the lines of sagas reveals a constant struggle for dignity, identity, and survival that Vikings could never fully suppress. Physical resistance, though dangerous, did occur. The Icelandic sagas mention female thralls who poisoned their masters, though the descriptions are brief and condemning. Archaeological evidence of sudden deaths in Viking Age households, particularly of adult men with no signs of violence, suggests poisoning might have been more common than recorded. Women with knowledge of herbs, a common female skill, could slowly poison oppressors with plants that mimicked natural illness. Infanticide as resistance appears in legal codes that prescribe punishments for female thralls who killed newborns. While Vikings interpreted this as evil, it might represent women refusing to bring children into slavery. The choice to deny their captors another generation of slaves, even at tremendous personal cost, was perhaps the ultimate act of resistance. The frequency of laws against this suggests it happened often enough to require legal response. Cultural resistance took subtle forms. Archaeological finds include small objects, carved stones, hidden jewelry, tiny religious symbols that suggest captured women maintained connections to their original cultures despite prohibition. These objects, hidden in slave quarters or buried in secret spots, represent desperate attempts to preserve identity. Some runestones include markings that don't match Norse traditions, possibly made by literate captured women leaving records in their own languages. The preservation of stories and songs from their homelands was another form of resistance. While forced to speak Norse publicly, women sang lullabies in their native languages to their children, whispered prayers in Latin or Gaelic, told stories of their homelands when Vikings couldn't hear. Some sagas mention Norse children who mysteriously knew Irish songs or Christian prayers, knowledge that could only have come from thrall mothers secretly teaching them. Networks of mutual support among captured women existed despite Viking attempts to prevent them. Archaeological evidence of items moved between slave quarters, sharing of food and resources, and coordinated work slowdowns suggest women found ways to support each other. The sagas occasionally mention groups of female thralls who became sick simultaneously, possibly coordinated resistance through work stoppage. Suicide, tragically, was sometimes seen as the only escape. Viking Age burials include women who appear to have died by their own hand, poisoned, drowned, hanged. While Vikings might have interpreted these as accidents or murders, the positioning of bodies and accompanying objects sometimes suggest deliberate self-harm. The frequency of laws against thralls taking their own lives indicates this was common enough to threaten the economic system. The children born to captured women represent one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Viking slavery. These children, products of systematic rape and forced relationships, occupied a liminal space in Viking society, neither fully slave nor fully free, claimed by neither their mother's destroyed culture nor their father's violent one. Their existence embodied the generational trauma that Viking slavery inflicted. The legal status of children born to female thralls was complex and cruel. According to most Norse law codes, children inherited their mother's slave status regardless of their father's position. A child could be the son of a jarl, recognized and acknowledged, but if their mother was a thrall, they remained property unless formally freed. This created households where half-siblings were divided between slavery and freedom, where family bonds were fractured by legal status. The psychological impact on these children was devastating. They grew up seeing their mothers, often the only parent who cared for them, treated as property, beaten, sexually assaulted, worked to exhaustion. They learned early that their mothers were considered less than human, and by extension, so were they. The internalization of this inferior status created deep psychological wounds that persisted even if they were eventually freed. Some fathers showed affection for children born to their female thralls, creating complex emotional situations. A father might teach his thrall-born son to fight, give him gifts, show pride in his accomplishments, but still keep him legally enslaved. These children lived in emotional confusion, receiving paternal attention while remaining property. The cognitive dissonance of being both son and slave created identity crises that sagas occasionally hint at, but never fully explore. The treatment of these children by legitimate family members varied widely. Some legitimate wives and children treated thrall-born half-siblings with active cruelty, seeing them as living reminders of the master's activities with slaves. Others showed kindness that was still tinged with superiority. The thrall-born children navigated constantly shifting dynamics, never knowing whether they would face cruelty or condescension. Education for thrall-born children was deliberately limited. They might learn practical skills, but were forbidden from learning weapons, use, law, or poetry, knowledge that could elevate status. Some sagas mention thrall-born children who secretly learned to read runes or compose poetry, skills that marked them as dangerously ambitious. The systematic denial of education ensured that even freed thrall-born individuals remained disadvantaged. The possibility of freedom through manumission created hope and despair in equal measure. Some fathers freed their thrall-born children, particularly sons who showed promise, but freedom didn't mean equality. Freed thralls and their children faced legal restrictions, social stigma, and economic disadvantages that persisted for generations. The Norse term leysingi, freedman, marked someone as formally enslaved, a status that carried shame and limitation. The Viking slave trade wasn't conducted in isolation, but was integrated into a vast international network that stretched from Iceland to Baghdad, from Dublin to Constantinople. Captured women moved through this network like commodities in a global market. Their bodies, the currency that funded Viking expansion and connected diverse cultures through the darkest possible exchange. The route from Ireland to Iceland was one of the most traveled slave corridors. DNA studies reveal that while most Icelandic males have Norse ancestry, a significant percentage of Icelandic females have Celtic ancestry. Genetic evidence of the thousands of Irish women taken as slaves during Iceland's settlement. Ships designed specifically for human cargo made regular runs, their holds modified with chains, ventilation systems to keep cargo alive, and segregation areas to prevent different types of slaves from mixing. The eastern route, through Russia, represented an even larger scale operation. The Rus Vikings controlled river routes from the Baltic to the Black Sea, establishing fortified posts along the way that served as collection points for slaves. Slavic women captured in raids would be held at these posts until enough were accumulated to justify a convoy to Constantinople. These convoys could include hundreds of women, guarded by armed Vikings who had turned human trafficking into military science. The Mediterranean markets added another dimension to the trade. Vikings sold women to Arab merchants in Spain, to Byzantine traders in Italy, to Jewish merchants who moved between Christian and Islamic worlds. Each market had preferences. Arabs preferred blonde women as exotic curiosities. Byzantines wanted educated women who could serve in complex households. Italian merchants sought women with specific skills like silk weaving. The development of specialized slave traders reveals the trade's sophistication. Some Vikings became professional slave merchants, maintaining networks of contacts, understanding different markets' preferences, developing expertise in evaluating and pricing human cargo. They kept detailed records, some of which survive as runic inscriptions recording numbers and origins of slaves sold. These weren't warriors who took slaves as battle spoils, but businessmen whose entire careers centered on human trafficking. The financial instruments developed for slave trading were surprisingly modern. Credit systems allowed buyers to purchase slaves on promise of future payment. Insurance systems compensated traders if slaves died in transit. Currency exchange networks allowed payment in diverse forms: Islamic dinars, Byzantine solidi, Frankish deniers, and always silver by weight. The slave trade drove financial innovation that would later be applied to other commerce. The decline of Viking slave raiding didn't happen suddenly, but transformed gradually as Scandinavia converted to Christianity and integrated into European political structures. However, the end of large-scale slave raids didn't mean freedom for women already enslaved or their descendants. Instead, slavery evolved into other forms of oppression that perpetuated the suffering for generations. The Christian conversion of Scandinavia created theological conflicts with slavery that were resolved through disturbing compromises. The Church condemned the enslavement of Christians, but was ambiguous about existing slaves and completely silent about non-Christian slaves. This led to situations where Viking lords would prevent their slaves from converting to Christianity to maintain their legal right to own them, denying them spiritual comfort along with physical freedom. The transformation of slavery into serfdom meant that many female thralls simply became unfree peasants, tied to land rather than owners, but hardly more free. Their children inherited this unfree status. Their labor obligations continued. The violence and sexual exploitation continued under different legal frameworks. The main change was that they couldn't be sold away from the land. Cold comfort when the land itself could be sold with them attached. The manumission of slaves as Vikings converted to Christianity often came with conditions that perpetuated dependence. Freed female slaves might be required to continue working for their former masters for years. They might be freed, but have their children remain enslaved. They might gain legal freedom but face economic circumstances that forced them back into servitude. Freedom, when it came, was often more theoretical than practical. The integration of former slaves into Christian Scandinavian society was marked by persistent discrimination. Church records from medieval Iceland show that descendants of slaves were barred from certain positions for generations. Marriage restrictions prevented former slaves from marrying into free families. Economic limitations kept them in poverty. The stigma of slave ancestry followed bloodlines for centuries. The linguistic legacy of Viking slavery, particularly regarding captured women, permeates Scandinavian languages and literature in ways that reveal how deeply embedded human trafficking was in Norse culture. Words, phrases, and literary conventions that seem innocent today carry echoes of systematic oppression that shaped entire societies. The Old Norse vocabulary for enslaved women was extensive and specific, indicating how central they were to Viking life. Beyond the general term, ambat for female slave, there were specialized terms: seta, concubine slave; deja, dairy slave; curling, old female slave; grithkona, protected female slave. Each term encoded specific types of exploitation, particular roles in the household economy, different levels of degradation. The sagas, while written centuries after the Viking Age, preserve attitudes toward captured women that reveal normalized atrocity. Female slaves appear as background figures, nameless, voiceless, present only to serve plot functions or demonstrate their owner's wealth. When they do speak, it's usually to deliver prophecies or curses before dying. Their humanity is so thoroughly erased that their suffering isn't even considered worth narrating. The poetry of the Viking Age, particularly the Eddic poems, contains references to captured women that are often mistranslated or softened in modern versions. Terms that literally mean rape survivor are translated as maiden. Descriptions of slave raids are rendered as adventures. The systematic sanitization of translation has obscured the centrality of female slavery to Viking culture. The impact on Celtic literature, particularly Irish literature, shows the other side of this linguistic legacy. Old Irish contains numerous Norse loanwords related to slavery and oppression. Irish poetry from the Viking Age and immediately after contains laments for captured women that are among the most heartbreaking in medieval literature. The Book of Leinster includes poems specifically about women taken in Viking raids, their voices imagined by those left behind. Place names across the former Viking world encode the history of slavery. Names containing elements like thrall, thrall, or ambat, female slave, mark locations where slaves were traded, held, or worked. In Iceland, DNA studies of modern populations from areas with slave-related place names show higher percentages of Celtic ancestry, suggesting these were areas where captured women were concentrated. Contemporary popular culture has romanticized Vikings to such an extent that the reality of their slave trade, particularly the systematic trafficking of women, has been almost entirely obscured. Television shows, movies, and novels present Vikings as rough but noble warriors, while ignoring or sanitizing the human trafficking that funded their expansion and defined their economy. The Viking woman warrior narrative, while having some historical basis, has been used to obscure the reality that the vast majority of women in Viking society were either potential victims of slavery or participants in enslaving others. The focus on exceptional women, like warriors or queens, diverts attention from the thousands of unnamed women who suffered in bondage. For every woman who might have wielded a sword, hundreds were enslaved. Modern Scandinavian national identities have struggled with this history. The Viking Age is celebrated for exploration, trade, and cultural achievement, while the slave trade is minimized or ignored. Museums focus on ships, weapons, and art while devoting minimal space to slavery. The cognitive dissonance of celebrating ancestors who were human traffickers is resolved by simply not discussing it. The genetic legacy of Viking slavery is often misrepresented. Commercial DNA tests that reveal Viking ancestry don't distinguish between descent from Vikings and descent from their slaves. Many people celebrating their Viking heritage are actually descendants of captured women who suffered terribly at Viking hands. The irony of identifying with the oppressors rather than the oppressed reveals how thoroughly the reality of Viking slavery has been obscured. Academic approaches have sometimes perpetuated misconceptions by focusing on Vikings as traders and explorers while treating slavery as a footnote. Economic histories of the Viking Age might mention slaves as trade goods without examining the human reality. Military histories focus on battles and tactics without discussing what happened to captured populations. This compartmentalization obscures slavery's centrality to Viking society. The Viking reenactment communities rarely acknowledge slavery's role in the culture they're recreating. Events feature combat demonstrations, craft displays, and period clothing, while omitting the enslaved people who would have been omnipresent in actual Viking society. This selective recreation perpetuates a sanitized vision that obscures historical reality. As we reach the end of this examination, the full scope of what Vikings did to captured women becomes clear, not just in its brutality, but in its systematic, calculated nature. This wasn't random violence, but an organized system of human trafficking that shaped economics, demographics, and cultures across Europe and beyond for centuries. The numbers, though impossible to determine precisely, were staggering. Conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of women were enslaved during the Viking Age. Some scholars argue the number exceeded 1 million. Each number represents a human being, a woman with a name, a family, a culture, a life that was destroyed for Viking profit. The scale of suffering is literally incomprehensible. The demographic impact changed the genetic landscape of Europe. Iceland's population, as mentioned, shows clear evidence of mass female slavery in its founding. But the impact extends far beyond Iceland. Genetic studies across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and Eastern Europe reveal the movements of enslaved women through DNA. Modern populations carry in their cells the evidence of historical atrocity. The economic impact of female slavery on Viking society cannot be overstated. The wealth that funded Viking expansion, that built their ships, that supported their armies, came significantly from human trafficking. Remove the slave trade from Viking economy, and their entire civilization becomes inexplicable. The longships that we admire in museums were built with profits from human misery. The social structures of Viking society were fundamentally shaped by slavery. The distinction between free and enslaved, the hierarchies of worth, the concepts of honor and shame, All were defined in relation to the slave system. Viking culture wasn't accidentally involved in slavery. Slavery was foundational to Viking culture. Every aspect of their society touched and was touched by the institution of human bondage. The psychological impact on both enslaved and enslavers created generational trauma that shaped medieval European consciousness. The fear of Viking raids created cultures of anxiety. The participation in slavery created cultures of complicity. The normalization of extreme violence against women established patterns that persisted long after the Viking Age ended. We live with the psychological echoes of Viking slavery even today. The religious and philosophical implications challenged fundamental beliefs about human nature and divine justice. How could God allow such suffering? How could humans inflict such suffering? The Viking slave trade forced medieval thinkers to grapple with questions about evil, freedom, and humanity that shaped theological and philosophical development. The questions raised by Viking slavery haven't been fully answered even now. The transformation of Viking slavery into other forms of oppression reminds us that injustice evolves rather than disappears. The female thralls who became serfs, the slave-born children who faced generations of discrimination, the traumatized populations who carried fear in their cultural DNA, all represent continuities of suffering that extended far beyond the Viking Age itself. What Vikings did to captured women was worse than we imagine, not just because of the physical brutality, though that was horrific, but because of the systematic destruction of humanity it represented. These women weren't just enslaved. They were commodified, traded, bred, and discarded. Their identities were erased, their cultures destroyed, their children born into bondage. They suffered not just as individuals, but as representatives of conquered peoples. Their bodies, the sites where Viking dominance was enacted and reenacted. The recovery of this history isn't about condemning modern Scandinavians or romanticizing victims. It's about understanding the full truth of the Viking Age and recognizing how human trafficking shaped medieval Europe. It's about acknowledging the thousands of women whose suffering funded what we now celebrate as Viking achievement. It's about seeing how normalized atrocity can become when economic incentives align with cultural beliefs. The women captured by Vikings left few records of their own experiences. Their voices were silenced by illiteracy, by language barriers, by the simple fact that no one thought their perspectives worth recording. But their presence echoes through the historical record, in the DNA of populations, in the archaeology of settlements, in the gaps and silences of sagas, in the defensive structures communities built, in the prayers for deliverance from Viking raids. Sister Elf Gifu, with whom we began this journey, represents hundreds of thousands of women whose lives were destroyed by Viking slavery. We don't know her fate, whether she died in transport, was sold in Dublin, ended up in a Scandinavian household, or was ransomed back to England. Her individual story is lost, subsumed into the massive scale of suffering that Viking slavery represented. But we know the system that consumed her. We know the markets where she would have been sold, the laws that governed her status, the work she would have performed, the violence she would have endured. We know the theological beliefs that justified her enslavement, the economic calculations that determined her value, the social structures that normalized her suffering. We know enough to understand that what Vikings did to captured women was indeed worse than most imagine. The legacy of Viking female slavery persists in unexpected ways, in the place names that dot maps across Europe, in the DNA that flows through millions of people, in the linguistic structures that encode historical trauma, in the defensive architectures of churches and monasteries, in the gender dynamics that shaped medieval society, in the economic systems that normalized human trafficking. The Vikings are gone, but the impact of their slave trade remains. As we close this examination, we're left with uncomfortable recognitions. The Vikings we celebrate for their exploration and trade were human traffickers on a massive scale. The expansion we admire was funded by slavery. The sagas we read as literature are built on foundations of unrecorded suffering. The history we thought we knew is incomplete without acknowledging the centrality of female slavery to Viking society. The captured women of the Viking Age deserve more than historical footnotes. They deserve recognition as central figures in medieval European history. Their suffering shaped economies, demographics, and cultures. Their resistance, though largely unrecorded, must have existed. Humans don't submit to such oppression without fighting back somehow. Their survival, for those who survived, represents extraordinary human resilience. The truth about what Vikings did to captured women is not comfortable. It challenges romanticized narratives about the Viking Age. It forces us to confront the capacity for systematized cruelty in human societies. It reveals how completely human trafficking can be normalized when economic and cultural incentives align. It shows how the suffering of women has been historically minimized or erased from official records. But this truth is necessary, not for condemnation of the past, but for understanding of the present. The systems that enabled Viking slavery, dehumanization, commodification, normalized violence persist in different forms today. The erasure of women's suffering from historical narratives continues. The romanticization of violent cultures while ignoring their victims remains common. The women captured by Vikings cannot speak for themselves across the centuries, but the evidence of their existence and suffering is overwhelming. In DNA, in archaeology, in the spaces between words and sagas, in the defensive structures of monasteries, in the demographic patterns of nations. Their presence is felt even in absence. They were there. They suffered. They survived or died. They mattered. What Vikings did to captured women was systematic human trafficking on a scale that shaped medieval Europe. It was normalized atrocity that funded expansion and created wealth. It was the commodification of human beings that treated women as products to be processed and sold. It was the destruction of cultures through the enslavement of their women. It was horror made mundane through repetition and rationalization. This is the complete truth, as far as historical evidence allows us to know it. The Vikings were many things: explorers, traders, warriors, poets. But they were also human traffickers, who destroyed hundreds of thousands of women's lives for profit. That reality doesn't negate their achievements, but it contextualizes them. The longships were built with slave profits. The trade networks moved human cargo. The settlements were built on forced labor. The captured women of the Viking Age were not footnotes to history. They were central to it. Their suffering was not incidental, but foundational. Their stories, though largely unrecorded, shaped the world we inherited. They deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings, whose lives were destroyed by a system that treated them as products. The bells of Whitby Abbey are long silent. The monastery where Sister Elfgafu was captured is ruins. The Vikings who took her are dust. But the impact of that morning in 867 AD, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of similar mornings across centuries, created ripples that still move through history. The captured women are gone, but their presence and absence shapes us still. This is what Vikings did to captured women after raids. It was worse than you imagined, because it was systematic rather than random, economic rather than simply violent, normalized rather than exceptional. It shaped the medieval world in ways we're only beginning to understand, and it reminds us that human trafficking, in any era, leaves wounds that take centuries to heal, if they ever heal at all. The truth is complete. The horror is documented. The women are remembered. Their suffering will not be forgotten again. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase, And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.